Meeting is being recorded.
Recording in progress.
Hello and welcome to the final session of Panel 2. This is session 2.5 about guiding future policy innovation. And by coincidence, all of our speakers have a UK base today, but I'm sure that there'll be insights for you wherever you're listening from or wherever you're dialing in from. And it's a bit of a bittersweet feeling. Obviously, it's the last of our sessions in Panel 2, and the week is slowly but surely closing out. So that's the bitter side of it, but the sweet is very much the three exciting presentations that we've got lined up today. So we're going to start with Colin Alden about energy demand policy making in the context of a just transition to net zero. Then Catherine Novell will talk about the role of policy in creating opportunities for alternative futures in heat decarbonisation. And then finally, Claire Downing will talk about the role of knowledge exchange in energy demand policy innovation. All that leaves me to say is please get your questions in nice and early so that we have time to process them and put them to the speakers. Following each recording of the presentation, there'll be around a 5-minute opportunity for questions, and then we'll close with a broader question and answer session at the end. So without further ado, over to the first recording of our first speaker. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Colin Alden, and I'm presenting a paper on energy demand policy making attention in the context of a just transition to net zero, and it reports the results of a UK survey. This paper was drafted together with Nick Eyre and Tina Fawcett of the Policy and Governance team of the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions. So this paper tests the following hypothesis. The hypothesis is that energy demand reductions, which come from measures to improve energy efficiency and changes in the underlying demand for services, have contributed more to carbon emission reduction than the combined effects of deploying low carbon generation technology. Yet energy demand appears to receive less policy-making attention than energy supply, even where demand side change could secure similar policy objectives more cost effectively. We tested this hypothesis using the following methodology. So it involved an expert survey with between 71 and 98 responses to elicit opinions on 4 predictive or probable what-if scenarios that address the question, what will happen? 2 explorative or possible strategic scenarios that address the question, what can happen? And 2 normative or preferable transforming scenarios that address the question, how will it happen? And we gathered data, firstly, during the whole centre meeting of the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions in June 2020, which resulted in 45 to 52 responses. Then the Community Energy Conference 2020 hosted by Community Energy England, which resulted in between 19 and 27 responses. And then between July 2020 and November 2020 as part of qualitative research interviews and during the UK German Energy Systems Symposium hosted by the Royal Academy of Engineering. So overall the survey is biased towards energy demand expertise while representing the views of a mix of generalists and specialists. The first question asked, do policymakers understand the contribution of energy demand solutions to a zero carbon future? So 44.4% of the respondents answered no. 45.7%, so just slightly more, suggests that yes, policymakers understand it, but they don't see it as a policy priority. And just under 10% of the respondents suggest that yes, they do understand the contribution of energy demand solutions to a zero carbon future, and they also see it as a policy making priority. This again confirms our hypothesis that energy demand receives less attention than energy supply in policy making. The next question asks how energy demand solutions should be mainly financed. 62% of the respondents suggest that it should be financed through general taxation, and 90% each for private investment and energy bills. Of course, the respondents understand well that energy demand solutions need to be financed through a wide range of options, but this suggests a tendency or a preference for general taxation, which might reflect experience of supply subsidies such as feed-in tariffs, which were paid through energy bills and are regressive in nature. In the next question we asked, which approaches to sustainable energy received the most policy-making attention? And here we provided the respondents with the following answers. So target setting, such as carbon reduction targets, changing practices, such as working from home, standards, such as A++ efficiency ratings, market-based instruments, such as feed-in tariffs, regulation, such as the banning of the sale of fossil fuel-powered vehicles, finance and funding, such as the European Green Deal, and technologies, such as solar PV. And here we provided respondents the option to provide us with 3 answers. And as we can see, technologies come top, followed by target setting and market-based instruments. Whereas regulation and finance appear to receive less policy-making attention, standards even less, and changing practices appear to not play any role at all in policy-making attention, or hardly any role. Now, in the following question, we asked respondents which approaches to sustainable energy require more policy-making attention for a just transition to net zero, and we provided them with the same range of answers. And it's very interesting to note that in this case, funding and finance, regulation, and changing practices came top, followed by standards, whereas the 3 answers that came top in the last question, so what currently receives most policy-making attention, which is technologies, market-based instruments, and target setting, came last, which suggests that respondents favour a different approach to energy policy making for a just transition compared to our current policy making approach. Next, we asked the respondents, what changes will net zero policies bring about? And we provided the option to provide 5 answers in this case, so multiple choice answer. And the 5 answers provided is a modal shift to active travel. So that's more people cycling, walking, fewer people driving. Changing working practices, such as working from home. Demand side response, such as remotely switching on and off electrical appliances. More electric vehicle infrastructure. Circular material and product economies, such as recycling of building materials. More high standard whole house retrofits, such as truly zero carbon homes. More nuclear power. The development of a hydrogen infrastructure. More household solar PV. And more offshore wind. And in this case, the respondents suggest that net zero policies will deliver more offshore wind and more EV infrastructure, followed by more high standard whole house retrofits, more demand side response, and more household solar PV. Other answers got fewer responses, such as development of hydrogen infrastructure and more shift to active travel. Interestingly, changing work practices got a low percentage of answers, which, if the same question was answered now, might yield a slightly different result. So regarding circular material and product economies, there appears to be less confident in current policy making that this will be delivered. Now, in the next question, we asked the same we provided the same answers, but for a different question, which is what changes should we prioritize for a just transition to net zero? And here we can see a strong prioritization for solutions on the demand side, especially more high standard whole house retrofits, modal shift to active travel, more demand side response, circular material and product economies, and changing work practices. It's interesting that, for example, offshore wind is not seen as a priority for a just transition to net zero, at least compared to the current policy making priority. Next, we asked the respondents, from which point onwards might we see the diffusion or the emergence of unsubsidized markets for the following? Now, this graph needs a bit of disentangling, so we provided the same range of approaches as the previous question, but in this case we provided a time scale between 2020 and 2050, or after 2050 or never. And as we can see, for some technologies, so that's at the front of this graph, we can see offshore wind and household solar PV. So there's an expectation among the respondents that household solar PV will be diffusible in unsubsidized markets in the near future, probably in the next 5 to 10 years. And it's slightly later for offshore wind. Whereas behind that, for example, we can see hydrogen infrastructure. There's much greater uncertainty there, with a significant share of the respondents suggesting it would be after 2050 or never. And for nuclear power, this is even more stark, with a very large share of respondents, nearly 50%, suggesting that nuclear power will only diffuse or emerge in unsubsidized markets from 2050 onwards or never. Regarding the modal shift to active travel, there's an expectation that this will happen probably in the next 20 years. Regarding changing work practices and demand side response, this is more likely to happen in the next maybe 10 to 15 years. And regarding electric vehicle charging infrastructure and circular economies, that's probably going to happen again, probably about 15 to 20 years from now. And the final question we asked was, to what extent do you think the following are important for a just transition to net zero? Now we split the answers here in two. So first of all, we talk about the importance for net zero. And we can see that education and awareness of the public is deemed very important for the net zero target, as is policy support for existing technologies, which appears to be a no-risk option, as very few people rated support for current technologies as of very low importance to reach net zero. This is followed by regulatory and institutional change for of energy system governance with a focus on humans instead of technology, and then shifting the focus to energy demand solutions, which might come as a surprise that this didn't feature or wasn't the top priority of the respondents. But again, it appears to be a very low risk option, as only 3% of the respondents suggest that it is not important for a transition to net zero. What might be interesting to note is here at the bottom we can see topics which will be discussed at COP26, for example, which is assigning monetary value to carbon emission reductions and UK participation in international carbon markets, are deemed overall less important for the transition to net zero. Now, this table, we look at the importance for a just transition. So the emphasis here is on the just transition rather than net zero. And we can see a different picture. So top again is education and awareness of the public. But in second place, we have regulatory and institutional change of energy system governance with humans, with a greater human focus rather than a technology focus. It's interesting to note that that is the only approach which we suggested, which actually is rated higher for a just transition than for reaching net zero, which suggests actually that all the approaches that we suggested are not really as suitable for a just transition as they are for decarbonisation. It also points towards several low-risk options, which again are education and awareness raising of the public, policy support for existing technologies, and shifting the focus to energy demand solutions, which, as we can see here, actually received the fewest low or very low answers here alongside education and awareness of the public. So it seems that energy demand solutions might also harbour greater potential for a just transition than other solutions that we have suggested here. So to conclude, the findings confirm the hypothesis that energy demand receives less policy-making attention than energy supply. Findings also suggest that the current focus on technological substitution and innovation through target setting and market-based instruments is deemed insufficient to achieve a just transition to net zero. So the respondents' preferences for a modal shift, demand-side response, circular material and product economies, and working practices are outside the traditional remit of energy policy. And overall, it appears that we need to focus more on humans, so for example through education and awareness, as well as regulatory and institutional change of energy system operation, existing technologies and energy demand reductions to lay the foundation for an inclusive transformation which extends beyond supply decarbonisation and technologies. But a more holistic approach is necessary to achieve a truly just transition to net zero. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Colin. That was really interesting presentation, and obviously the paper it was based on as well. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. I think I'll start with one from Hans Nielsen, which asked, is there a trace of Brexit attitudes in the responses at all? Or did you find that with the responses that you analysed?
I don't think there is a trace. Now, I have been conducting follow-up interviews, and so far I've conducted 10 interviews and I want to conduct some more. And people only hinted at Brexit as a potential factor within energy policy. It doesn't appear to really feature much in terms of, for example, the long-term planning when it comes to 2050 and looking forward to a just transition to net zero. So I don't think that Brexit played much of a role in terms of people's opinions in this case. And I'm also undertaking a parallel study in the Netherlands and another one in Germany. And overall, the responses are, I mean, there are differences, but they're broadly similar, which suggests that Brexit probably does not play much of a role here.
Thank you. And the next question is from Tina Fawcett. Colin, you mentioned a couple of times that responses around changing work behaviour options might be different now. Are there any options you think you think people might think differently about as a result of COVID?
That's a very good question. With changing work practices, I think the jury's still out, and it will be for quite some while, until we can really figure out how our working practices will change as a result of the COVID crisis. I think initially people enjoyed the freedom of working from home, but I think at this stage people are a bit sick of it and are quite keen to return to more collaborative working environments. And it's difficult really to know what kind of energy demand and supply consequences this will have. I mean, I think we can see a tendency of companies now looking to reduce the amount of office space that they offer to their employees. At the same time, people potentially moving out to locations which are further away from the workplace, which could, so while people might reduce the amount of times they might commute into cities, they might actually be commuting longer distances. So that might actually work out as a zero-sum game, like effectively. And the office space will be used for something else eventually. So it's really difficult to know what the actual outcome of that will be. And then, so changing working practices, I think it is something that we're already witnessing a significant change. But yeah, I think it's far too early to actually make any judgment in terms of where this is heading.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think we're all trying to work out exactly how sustainable our current practices are, and whether the sort of initial excitement perhaps of having that flexibility is actually something that we do want over the long run. I'd just like to turn to the just transition aspect of the study now. So we've had a question come in about whether you could reflect on the meaning of the just transition and what it's expected to mean to these experts. So are there additional voices that would or should be considered for extending this work to further explore the just transition element?
Yeah, this was actually one of the main critiques of the survey, was that I hadn't made clear what I understand by a just transition. And we're seeing different interpretations put forward. I mean, some people understand it as ensuring that carbon intense areas, especially, for example, coal mining areas, that the people working in these heavy industries are not left behind through the shutting down of their workplaces, for example. Others see it more as a broader societal transition. So to ensure that, for example, current retail electricity market structures, which tend to disadvantage people in energy poverty, that these structures are challenged, and that the overall energy system ensures that people are not disadvantaged because of their position and their maybe lack of ability to engage with consumer choice decisions that might save them money, for example. So that's why this is certainly something that was much of a discussion in the interviews to really establish what a just transition really is. And yeah, I should probably make sure that I do speak to more people who might be of a disadvantaged position, because so far I've only really spoken to energy experts. So, and it's this expert view on what a just transition is and who the disadvantaged people are. So it is right that I need to extend my scope and maybe speak to organizations that are more at the at the cold face, so to speak, of people who are being disadvantaged by current trends of the energy transition.
Great, thank you. And I'll just squeeze in a final question, but also flag that there has been one, an additional one that I won't get around to asking in the Q&A. So if you did have a chance to go in after. And the final question is, what are the next steps for this project? I think you mentioned further interviews in different countries and different contexts, but is there, are there any other next steps that you're able to share with us today?
Yes, so as I mentioned, so I'm conducting the same survey in Germany and the Netherlands. To assess whether there is this this policy asymmetry is as evident in other countries, and whether there's any findings or deeper understandings that we can derive from these different understandings. And I also want to interview people in these countries, again, to ensure how the people have understood the questions, because actually it is quite difficult to translate some of these concepts into different languages. In the Netherlands, for example, people have an excellent command of English on average. So it's possible to ask the same questions in English, whereas in Germany, we've had to translate the questions, and it's been a bit messy. So I need to ensure that the people have understood the questions as originally posed, and then hopefully be able to tie it up into a useful documents, possibly, well, I'm guessing will be journal publications. And yeah, it would be interesting to show these findings to policymakers to see what they make of these expert opinions on how policy is made and perceived.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And I'm sure we'll pick up some of these themes a bit further in the broader Q&A. But for now, I think over to the next speaker.
Thank you.
This research is about heat decarbonisation in the UK and how policy can contribute. And it's part of the OSTEP project, which is operationalising socio-technical energy transitions. Heating is becoming a priority area for decarbonisation. It represents a high proportion of emissions, but it's also seen as a relatively difficult area to decarbonise. And there's been increasing policy interest in this area. Some of that linked to a cross-economy net zero carbon emission target for 2050 that's introduced in the UK in 2019. The existing heating systems in the UK are dominated by natural gas used by individual boilers that provide both space and water heating. And compared across by European standards, this is within a housing stock that has relatively poor thermal efficiency. And in terms of the changes that are likely and expected in this area, there are a range of technological options that are developing, but there is not yet one single solution that's emerged. And it's not expected that there will be a sort of simple technology substitution, and people's behaviour and lifestyles are also going to be involved in this change, and all that makes this complicated. So in this research we apply socio-technical energy transitions ideas to help understand the situation in the sector and to consider policy interventions to enable reaching net zero targets. One of the key challenges here is in considering how concepts that are often applied historically or for structuring scenarios of the future can be applied in a live and unresolved, challenging setting for both policy and industry actors. So the STET concepts that we apply here are pathways and branching points, with branching points being defined as key decision points at which choices made by actors in response to internal or external stresses or triggers determine whether and in what ways the pathway is followed. Branching points have tended to be used historically or hypothetically, but they would seem to have potential for thinking about redirecting development to achieve net zero. The challenge is in moving the identification and the understanding of the shaping forces in action into the here and now. And branching points and pathways are two sides of the same coin. So if we're going to think about key decision points within a sector as branching points, they need to be mapped onto socio-technical pathways of development. And equally, if we're thinking about shaping pathways of change, then we need to be thinking about developing decision points to be opportunities for branching. So we developed and applied this 3-step process for mapping transition pathways. As you'll see from the column on the right, which shows more information about the data and analysis, this is based principally on policy documents, 11 interviews and 2 workshops with key policy and industry actors in the sector. And so analysing that data for the first step was to identify socio-technical pathways of development for low carbon heating, and what we found were 4 separate socio-technical pathways that were distinct in terms of the actors involved and how change was happening in these different pathways. But these are pathways that are not operating completely separately, they mutually influence one another, and so the second step was to map potential points of connection between the pathways and points of alignment and tension. And then the third step was to consider how these connection points might be turned into points of action and what that might imply for developing pathways. And so we took 2 examples of connection points, such as hybrid heat pumps and local area energy planning, and unpack the position and potential of those connection points. The 4 socio-technical pathways of development for decarbonised heating are shown here, and as you can see they're contrasting pathways with different actors and priorities and scales for decision making. So there's not currently a way of effectively comparing these pathways in order to select a single way ahead for heat decarbonisation. So there's a need to go beyond the idea of a single selection point. And it's increasingly acknowledged within the sector that a single technological solution is unlikely to emerge, and some combination of several of these development areas will be needed. the challenge for policy actors then in dealing with these four very separate pathways of change, that's how to facilitate connections between them and how to transparently structure decision spaces that will affect the further development and installation stages of these pathways. Now, analysing the interviews and then cross-checking with policy documents, we identified these areas where coordination between the socio-technical pathways is happening or is known to be needed. And there are a diversity of connection points represented here, not just technological developments like hybrid heat pumps, but also connection points connected to business models or to policy and regulation changes. So the first 6 connection points on the list are plotted on the right hand side and can be connected to particular pathways that are represented in these connection points. The other 5 open connections are areas where either these connections affect the whole sector, or where it's not yet clear which pathways will be central. And looking more closely, we can see that there are some different things going on here. So some of these connection points are potentially unintentional. For example, the low and no regret framing within policy, which is the idea that certain decisions should be taken now, that they're low or no regret, that they're relatively easy to make. And it's quite easy to see that it's possible that some pathways may have more of those types of decisions than others. So you may have a pathway that gets a series of those decisions taken because they're relatively easy to make, whereas another pathway has more specific or more difficult to take decisions and is sort of held back by that framing. And then there are some of these connection points that are structural, such as building regulations, but nonetheless how those changes are made will shape the environment within which these developments happen and connect to the priorities of the different pathways. And thirdly, there are also some of these that are more potentially intentional or certainly strategic connection points, and we take 2 of these examples to unpack further in step 3. The first example is hybrid heat pumps, which is where a heat pump is used in conjunction with a boiler running on natural gas or a low carbon gas like hydrogen, and the heat pump provides a base load for heating, and then the boiler can provide a high temperature top up or booster to provide that high temperature heating that people are currently used to. And the other example that we talk about a little bit more in the next slide is place-based local planning. So using case study material and a dedicated workshop, we looked at 2 examples in more detail, and more information on the place-based local energy planning example is shown here. And the idea of this step was to understand the underpinnings of a potential connection point and to look at how much could be understood about its potential development and contribution. So using the framework we trialled that's shown here, we can see techno-economic, socio-technical and political categories were used to capture different perspectives, and then different stages were considered. So questions over drivers for the connection point, what's needed to develop the connection space further, and then its potential to aid coordination towards decarbonisation. And looking in more detail, we can see that so contrasting areas were identified of things that would need to be developed for this connection space. So national to local infrastructure connections, capacity building, the planning at a local level, and need to encourage local authorities to develop place-based plans are all sort of quite different areas for development. But in looking at the characteristics of the connection point, we can look at not only sort of how much of the problem of decarbonisation it has the potential to solve, but also some of the other characteristics of the decision-making process that can also be of strategic importance. So highlighted here, we can see that there's the potential for users to have agency in this process, and as well as its potential to attract investment. And we can see as well that local authorities would be very important actors in this connection point, which is in contrast to the other connection points. So there's a potential to find out more about each connection point, but then also to look across the pathways and connection points to see potential alignments and tensions. So the mapping process that was trialled within this work could be developed to be done with stakeholders, and that holds potential to support further steps to address cross-sector coordination and look strategically for sites of learning and experimentation. And for example, looking across the different connection points identified, we might start to think about linking together different pathway connection points for learning. For example, hybrid heat pumps and the heat as a service business model approach. And it could be that sites are identified and nurtured for the role they can play in helping with decisions, alignment and coordination between these pathways. And if this isn't just a one-off process, but it's followed up with evaluations and reassessments, this could be part of a strategic process to shepherd policy in this area. So one initial contribution of this work is to show the limitations already in place. So the analysis highlights that a market or diffusion approach isn't ready, and a laissez-faire approach is not going to get heating decarbonisation done in time. And at the same time, it shows that a single policy directed decision and plan also doesn't appear to be practical. So the step lens allows us to look at that somewhat messy space in between, and hopefully to enable policy actors to get involved. And the branching points and pathways approach and the steps developed here allow an understanding of existing developments, as well as then looking for sites for policy actors to intervene, to understand those sites for strategic intervention. And the idea would be that this is developed into an ongoing process to support a strategic development towards decarbonisation. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. I haven't seen any questions come in on the chat, so I think I'll take the liberty of starting with one of my own. What I've taken from this is that there are a lot of different pathways that can be taken, and these might manifest at a local level or based on decisions about technologies that are made at a broader level. Do you see part of the challenge being that perhaps for some policymakers or politicians there may be, whereas with other sectors, say with electric vehicles, there is just an electrification broadly speaking. We're not talking about hydrogen vehicles in some places or heat network vehicles, whatever that would look like in other places. Is part of the difficulty conveying this complexity when we're trying to, or the reason perhaps that heat policy isn't or has some of these difficulties is because of this complexity at different situations, which is very difficult to get across to consumers in some ways. I don't know if I've explained that particularly well, but hopefully there's a question in there somewhere.
Thanks, James. Yes, absolutely. I think the complexity of this is really part of the problem. But at the same time, I mean, this work comes in the context of when we started, quite a few actors were framing the heat decarbonisation situation as a decision between electrification and hydrogen. Now, in some ways, obviously, that is it. It leads you down to kind of two technologies, and there's an idea that you can look at them both on a national level, and you have a decision between the two. Unfortunately, it's being found is that decision between two options doesn't quite work, and so there's kind of no choice to embrace the complexity, I guess, in this area. So I mean, one of the things that taking a step lens, I guess, does is it does push you to acknowledge the complexity, and then in developing this process, we're trying to find a way to map that, or to find a way through that complexity for people who aren't studying socio-technical transitions all the time, have other things to do. Tim, do you want to put that?
Yeah, thanks for the question, James. I mean, I think, obviously, as many sort of presentations at the conference have highlighted, that this is a big challenge for policymakers because it involves more behavioural factors. It's very sensitive to how people use energy, and that's related to their practices and routines. And governments are sort of tend to be not so keen to engage with that. Again, as we've seen from Colin's presentation. And so then there's the danger of making sort of too simplistic assumptions about how people will behave. And so, for example, in other work, we found that that there's an assumption that hybrid heat pumps would automatically be a stepping stone to full heat pump implementation. But work we've done, we found that that it may not be understood that way by people. People may see a hybrid heat pump as the heat pump not being able to provide the full service because you need the gas boiler as well. So so I think understanding that complexity, because there's uncertainty about technological options, but also uncertainty about the acceptance of different technologies by households and users.
Thank you very much. I think I'll just turn to a couple of questions that have come in. So the first one's from Jake Barnes, who asks, interesting presentation and work, Kat, and then asks, could you recap how you move from connections to decisions or policy support for decarbonisation?
Yes, I suspect in reality there's a lot more involved than our kind of nice map, but the idea is to make it more accessible or clear as to where there are opportunities to make changes, so where you can connect some things that are going on that look quite different and that wouldn't usually be seen at the same time. So I think it's yes. And I think there's a lot more work to do from people like Jake to make that kind of.
Yes, there's a bit of a weak connection, I think, but I think hopefully most people got most of that. Tim, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to what Kat was saying, I mean, I think obviously this is not simple, but and I think part of the complexity that we've sort of identified is there are definitely different actors involved in these different pathways, and they have their own priorities. And So, you know, policymakers do face this challenge of trying to have an overview of the whole sector and system. And so, you know, that's where we think that this thinking in terms of pathways, which is, again, is not how policymakers have traditionally thought about it, but we are now talking about, you know, net zero pathways to net zero. So that's starting to get into the discourse. And then we think that this idea of thinking about different pathways for decarbonisation and the connection points between them is then a natural sort of next step. So it's trying to sort of get that into the policy making discourse.
I guess as well, perhaps that could help shed a light on where these decisions need to be made. I think you spoke about a national decision. Perhaps if you look at a national scale, it might be easier to go, well, it's hydrogen or electrification. But as you narrow down, it might be a lot more nuanced in that. And yeah, I suppose policymakers may be able to then realise, actually, this is a decision for a local authority or a devolved administration, because that's where it's most appropriately made. And I'll just squeeze in a final question from Stefan Thomas, who's asked, is there a debate in the UK about inefficiency of using hydrogen versus heat pumps? And are there plans to require and support local authorities to perform local heat planning, as it's been very successful in Denmark for more than 40 years now? So I suppose that touches on the comment I just made, but yeah, if you could answer that would be great.
So there are various kind of local heat planning activities going on. They're being led by different organisations at the moment, and as yet there isn't a centralised or coordinated approach for everyone with the local heat plan. But it's definitely starting to happen. There's some kind of disparity where there are some local authorities who are very well set up to do that kind of work and others that aren't. So there are definitely steps that need to be taken to roll that out a bit more systematically, like it's been done elsewhere. The debate over electrification and hydrogen, I would say one of the things that we found is that the people who are talking about these different technologies are often situated in different places. So they're not necessarily talking in the same space with one technology pitched against the other. And that sort of point around where decisions are being made and where decisions are most appropriate to be made is one of the things this is showing, is that is different for those two different pathways, and for the other pathways it's different again.
Yeah, and I think we think there is a big potential role for this local area energy planning, but that, you know, hasn't traditionally been done in the UK, and local authorities haven't traditionally had a significant role in energy provision, but they are developing that role now. So certainly I think the UK can learn a lot from Denmark and other countries.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. I'm sure we'll pick up on some of these in the wider Q&A there as well. So if we could move on to the next presentation now.
Hello, I'm Claire Downing and I work at the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions. I'd like to talk to you today about the role of knowledge exchange in energy demand policy innovation. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-authors who are very much part of this team, and we all work together on this project. And they did a huge amount of contribution, is what I would say, so we all share the results. So in terms of summarising the study, what we did was we conducted a systematic literature review looking at knowledge exchange, and I'll talk about the research questions in a minute. It covered 8 subject areas, so we deliberately wanted to be very broad, and we recognised that actually knowledge exchange was used in many different fields, including all of those there, so education. Some of the search terms were a bit of a problem in the sense that we had environment, climate, sustainability and energy, and we recognised that obviously that's a very broad spectrum, but that's what we chose in the end. We then analysed all the different things that came out of the papers and distilled them down into factors. We then compared these factors against a case study from CREDS, and obviously you know, we all work at creds, so that's what so we're looking at the practice relative to the theory that's in the papers. And the conclusions look at the combined lessons from the literature and the empirical evidence from the case study. So in terms of our methodology, we looked at 2 research questions. What knowledge exchange lessons can be extracted from across a broad range of disciplines? And how these lessons are applicable to researchers in the energy demand field. And obviously that's where we link with creds. So in terms of a more detailed look at the methodology, we had 3 knowledge exchange search terms and 8 discipline. And we looked at Scopus and the Web of Science databases, and we chose 10 papers per discipline based on the citations. And then we did a kind of secondary tier analysis, looking at the abstracts with inclusion and exclusion criteria, and all of those are in the paper. This resulted in 80 papers, which are available at that link there. And we then obviously divided up those papers across the whole of the research team, the authors that you saw at the front, and we recorded those findings in a spreadsheet. I then looked at the analysis through NVivo, which is a qualitative analysis package. And this created a whole series of long list of nodes, if you like, long list of factors, with some sub-factors in it as well. And then that was synthesized down into 11 factors for knowledge exchange. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what is knowledge exchange, we have broken it down into knowledge and exchange. So knowledge is both kind of explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge. And explicit knowledge is the knowledge that everybody can share. So that's why we write papers or reports, all those kinds of things. So it's all stuff that's written down and can be viewed by somebody else. Tacit knowledge is very much implicit, i.e. it's experience, it's know-how, it's mostly in people's heads. So that's the kind of the contrast between those two. And then exchange covers a huge raft of activities, so including, you know, sharing and generation, but also very much co-production. So actually 2 or more, many groups working together to co-produce something, and where the knowledge is shared, and both you know, both of the parties move forward together, and there's a journey that you have together rather than, you know, one party moving forward without anybody else, kind of thing. And then also it was very clear in the literature that actually there was a huge range of synonyms used for this, all basically looking at the same kinds of things. And as there's, so there's more than 20 listed in the paper. So it's clear that there isn't a very strong definition of what knowledge exchange means across the whole of that kind of, well, all those 8 disciplines. I'd like to explain how knowledge exchange started and kind of where it's got to now, and obviously it's still on a journey going through. So initially it started very much as the expert to the layperson, so that was, you know, obviously normally academics to kind of local audiences. That's how its history started, and it's very much kind of sender receive, without anything sender, you know, out, and then you don't necessarily get anything back. And that's very much changed over the last 5 to 10 years to a very much more a two-way exchange of knowledge between parties. And this is an iterative process going over and over and over. You come back to each other and revise where you were, rather than a linear process, which is obviously where we started. It very much involves stakeholders and joint ownership and going on a journey together. As I say, knowledge is a process as opposed to a thing. Our paper defines knowledge exchange as a spectrum. So at one end we have the simple one-directional act of passing on information. At the other end we have this kind of co-production, this journey with stakeholders and long-term relationships. So that's what we think of as knowledge exchange. And then what I'd like to share with you is a little bit about what CREDS is about, and how we've done knowledge exchange, and then I'll go on to discuss the findings of the paper. So CREDS is a large research programme that runs for 5 years up until 2023. It's funded by the UK Research and Innovation, and it covers 10 themes, which you can see some of those: policy, governance, transport, materials, buildings, a whole raft of things related to energy demand. it clearly covers reducing demand. It also covers energy efficiency. It also covers improving demand side flexibility. So it covers, you know, a wide range of different areas within energy demand. And just for clarity, that most of the authors are within the knowledge exchange team within CRED, so we are definitely biased, is what I would say. So, and then moving on to show you a couple of examples from CREDs that have, as a result of knowledge exchanged, created some policy impact, and these are still reasonably early in their journey, but you know, we think that they will go on to produce some more significant impact. One of them is the Local Government Association, which asked us, actually, they came to us rather than us coming to them, so clearly they knew what we were doing and why we were doing it. And they asked for help with their transport activities in order to reach the climate emergency targets that the local authorities had put together. So this is municipalities in European speak. And they basically got 3 sources of funding, including an acceleration award, impact acceleration award grant from CRED. So that's one of the ways that we actually support this kind of activity, is through grant funding specifically for external activities beyond the research. And what they did was they co-designed with the Local Government Association and the researchers 7 briefings, and they presented them over many webinars, and they got literally hundreds of local authorities involved in this work. So we have got a wide outreach now within the local authorities within the UK. The second one is to do with BEIS, which is the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, which is one of our central government departments within the UK. And we're looking at investigating improvements in energy performance certificates using smart meter data, so doing digital data, but also in building as opposed to estimated EPCs. And we now, after many years, have data sharing agreements with BEIS. We've had many secondments of staff. We're on to number 3, I think, and we have got specific tailor-made evidence with projects for them. So that's some of our policy impact within CREDS. And in terms of joining those 2 things again, so that's the literature review and the examples from CREDS, we've joined together those 2 things, and we've created this diagram in terms of designing the 11 factors for effective knowledge exchange. And we've used the kind of typical project cycle, if you like. So, you know, the starting situation, what do you begin with, and then in terms of the planning phase, and then actually kind of during the activity, during the project. And I'll go through each one of those. So in terms of the starting situation, knowledge exchange needs to take account of the context. Very much this is about internal organisational stuff as well as external circumstances. So in terms of organisational settings, obviously that's kind of, you know, what kind of organisation you come from and how the bureaucracy works within that. And then externally, it's about the politics of the country, it's about the funding situation, all of those kinds of things impact on how well, you know, and what you do within knowledge exchange. Knowledge exchange also needs to be tailor-made based on the context to the situation that you're in, and obviously there's far more detail in the paper. Secondly, the culture is a very important aspect, and what we mean by culture is people and their ethos and their ways of operating, and senior management can have a big impact on, you know, how that's taken forward and how well that is used. So moving on to the planning phase, obviously I am shooting through this because we don't have a huge amount of time, but there is lots more detail in the paper. So in terms of engaging stakeholders and building relationships, we recommend that the stakeholders are brought in very early, kind of in the design phase, before you even write the proposal, so that you can work together to share the ownership of that project going forward. As I've said, knowledge exchange we consider is a spectrum from one to the other and can occur at many depths. So at a kind of lighter level, we would talk about external stuff going from us, so from researchers, for example, to the outside world, and that would be considered dissemination. And then if you've got a longer term process, that's very much an iterative and evolving, and it involves different interventions over time. So you've got a whole range of different types of things that you can be doing at different depths and at different timescales. There are a significant number of barriers to knowledge exchange. Obviously, some of those are things like, the knowledge can be stolen, if you like. So obviously there's the issue of plagiarism, but there's also the issue of kind of competitiveness. So we recognise all of those kinds of things. There's also the fact that knowledge exchange is not often rewarded within research establishments, and the fact that knowledge exchange can be considered to take away from the research, take away from the focus of the research. But there are ways of overcoming those barriers. And then in terms of moving on to the actual activity, when you're doing the project, early reflection, monitoring and evaluation and learning should be there right from the beginning. So when you write the proposal, all of those aspects in terms of assessing the process of knowledge exchange as well as the outcome need to be in the mix at the beginning, and then the effort needs to be looked at all the way through. So kind of at least every year, probably every 6 months, you'd have a reflection and a learning process, and then an adjustment. So that the whole point is that you learn and adjust and change along the way, and we don't expect to know exactly what we're going to be dealing with, because when we first started the CREDS project, obviously there was no COVID, and now obviously things have changed radically. So we need to make sure that we reflect and update as we go along. The next one was different actors have different motivations, and actually there should be a clear strategic direction from the beginning so that everybody is on board with the same messaging. And the motivation can come from, again, all sorts of different places. So there's the academic motivation in terms of new knowledge, there's the competitiveness in terms of new businesses, and then there's all sorts of other things in terms of policy development for obviously policymakers. So the different stakeholders do have a different motivation, and you need to make sure that they're all on board from the beginning. Yes, knowledge exchange benefits from neutral facilitation, and we often would recommend intermediaries for this, because this could be a third party or this could be an internal specialist group, and they can kind of bring different parties together and also be a fairly neutral broker, and that's the kind of that's what's coming out in the literature, is that this neutral broker role. So moving on to the next set. Tools are necessary but not sufficient for knowledge exchange, so you can use IT till you're blue in the face, as it were, and there are obviously now a huge amount of great Zoom and all sorts of things that you can use, but they're not a substitute for actually doing the knowledge exchange, i.e. getting to know that person personally. The one-to-one long-term trusted relationship is where, and you can use the tools to facilitate that, but you can't do that on its own kind of thing with just tools. Then there are different types of knowledge that need to be integrated. We have seen that within the papers particularly, and we've seen this within practice within CREDS as well, that the more diverse people you have, the better the knowledge that comes out the other end, if you like, because it's wide from a wider perspective, and actually equally valuing all those different forms of knowledge. So that's expert knowledge plus local knowledge, plus all the different disciplines, plus the policy and practice, etc. All of those need to be valued together. So and then the other thing to include is that tacit knowledge is a problem, and actually what's in people's heads is difficult to get hold of sometimes, which is why the discussion is so important. The final thing is to say that power is not neutral. So knowledge is power, and actually those that know the knowledge are therefore powerful. So you need to make sure that this dynamic is addressed as you go through the process. So that's all of those. And then in conclusion, I'd like to just say that obviously, so we did this literature review. It revealed these 11 factors for effective knowledge exchange. This was viewed very much from the lens of an energy demand programme, so particularly CREDS, how that can support the knowledge exchange factors, can support energy policy innovation, and generate impact for research findings. And then we've drawn out the lessons, and obviously they're all there in the paper. And it's very clear that energy demand is not standard in, knowledge exchange is not standard in energy demand, but we think that actually it would be really valuable for most large research programs to influence policy in this way by using the knowledge exchange tools. And so yeah, so you say by engaging lots of different multiple stakeholders and having a really strategic approach to it, with a systematic evaluation, is actually the best way to go in terms of getting impact and getting policy change.
Thank you very much. We've got a couple of questions that have come in that I'll throw you away now. We've got one here from Claire. Very interesting. Where Taylor making knowledge exchange structures for particular outlets, research activities, and area work is gold standard, but assuming sometimes we would pragmatically build on structures and relationships built in one context, phase of project to another, what types of factors should we be assessing, looking at what needs to be consistent versus what might cope with some shifts? So I think I spoke in a fragmented way there. So would you like me to repeat some of that?
Yeah, could you say that again, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, that's my mistake. I think I'm probably not the best at reading on camera. So where tailor-making knowledge exchange structures for particular outlets, research activities, and areas of work is a gold standard, but assuming sometimes we would pragmatically build on structures and relationships built in one context or phase of projects to another, what types of factors should we be assessing, looking at what needs to be consistent versus what might cope with some shifts? Sorry, did I make that any clearer then?
Yes, slightly. Yeah, so I mean, I think this question, but I'm not entirely sure about the question is what I would say, but if they're asking about whether if you've already got existing contacts, then by all means use them again, is what I would say. I mean, and that's a very obvious, as you say, in terms of a pragmatic approach, that works really well. And we very much would do that. We do that ourselves a lot. But the point is, when you do the strategic overview, you would then identify where the gaps are with your existing stakeholders, if you like, and then you can go away and kind of look to fill those gaps, is what I would say. So that's in terms of building on the next phase, yes, by all means, use the foundations that you've already got, and then you build on that and fill in a few more gaps, and then the next phase round you build on that and fill in a few more gaps. So clearly we recognize that there's a resource implication to all these things, there's time implications and all those kinds of things. So yeah, very much do it in a phased approach, building one on top of the other, as you go through.
Great, thank you, and apologies. I think I very much butchered that. Hopefully I can be a bit clearer with this next question that we've had come in. Yeah, it starts with a thank you for running through that and the overview of knowledge exchange, and then it moves on to asking about how do you address the problem that experts and researchers might not be that independent when making suggestions? And I suppose this is about how do we move beyond the exchange of knowledge and ensuring that that information is credible and able to then influence policymakers and be used with the same weight that another source of information or knowledge could be used. And I suppose this does touch a little bit on what you were saying about the power in the presentation and that it isn't that knowledge isn't a neutral thing, but it would be great if you could expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, knowledge is never quite neutral, is what I would say. So the point is to acknowledge those biases, is what I would say. And I mean, we very much acknowledge that we work within CREDS and we've done a case study within CREDS, so we know that that's not a neutral thing, if you sort of mean. So it's the fact that you need to acknowledge that very clearly as you're going forward. And the other point is that, I mean, you can always get reviewers. I mean, this is the whole point of peer-reviewed documentation, isn't it? The fact that actually, whoever's done the work has an implicit bias, if you like, to put that forward and to put that viewpoint. And that's where peer review comes in and tries to, moderate that process. So you can very much do the same within knowledge exchange, is what I would say. You can get in third parties who are not part of the project. You can do an evaluation either externally or internally. So there's lots of different ways of bringing in some independence to go, to go against that bias, if you like. But it's also the fact that actually, if you're coming from two different biases, so if you've got policymakers and researchers and they're coming from very different places, that intermediary that actually does that kind of slight translation activity, again, gives that kind of cohesion, but also kind of helps to, you know, understand both parties, so that they can come together and do some co-creation, as opposed to sitting on the ends of the spectrum, which is obviously not what we want. So, you know, it's about that brokering role to actually bring people together. So there's a whole raft of different things that you can do, is what I would say. You can get this, yeah, you can get people to look at it, peer review it, and all those things, but they might still be researchers. Whereas if you get a really third party, so, you know, you get an independent, whatever, so a different department or something, you know, that's the kind of thing that, you know, brings some independence and takes away those biases, is what I would say.
And I suppose through that brokerage as well, you have that constructive debate, and that knowledge is enriched then, and perhaps made a bit more practical in some ways, or yeah, in other ways that may be a bit more theoretical when it's needed. I haven't seen any other questions come in, so I'll ask a question of my own. And do you think there's some context in which the sort of the power dimensions need to be taken more seriously than in others? So as an example, when Colin presented earlier, he spoke about the just transition context, and about how actually when we're engaging with something like a just transition that has significant moral implications and ethical implications for those in society, it might be really important to ensure that we have a breadth of perspectives offered, because your epistemic limits might mean that there are some things that you're not able to consider, whereas perhaps one might assume in a more technical scenario, maybe it's okay that you don't have a breadth of perspectives offered, or it may be that actually even the most technical things have such significant societal implications that we do want to try and acknowledge this power dimension and facilitate it, and facilitate that strive for that more equitable and balanced decision making wherever we can. Is it right to assume that there's perhaps places where we need to be more considerate of that than others, or do you think it is something that we should be consistently approaching?
I mean, in the just transition, there is a major challenge to include everybody who's involved in it, kind of thing. And I mean, I've worked for 10 years in adaptation, so I came from the other side as well. And adaptation is very much at the local level. And when you're looking at kind of flood prevention, you need to include those that are going to be flooded, because that's, you know, the intervention that you put in place has a huge implication for whether or not they're flooded again, kind of thing. So from that point of view, yes, you can always include more of the people that are going to be impacted by the whatever it is you're putting in place, so the policy or whatever, and getting those people on board again would be the gold standard. But we are, you know, we have to recognize that it's not necessarily very easy to get those people involved. So, you know, you need to then potentially look at kind of proxies or getting other people to stand in for that group. So, I mean, the kind of things that we've used in the past are kind of associations and things like that. So, you know, you'd go through a trade association or something like that if you're trying to get to a business sector, or you could go with a community group or whatever. So you could get a representation from that point of view. So you wouldn't necessarily go to the actual individuals that you're working with, because that could be a huge, you know, a huge volume, but B, take a lot of time, and you might not have that within the project space. But by going to these, again, these kind of other intermediaries, if you like, you can get to a similar perspective range, but you're only talking to potentially, you know, 3 or 4 people, which makes it far more practical.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I think we'll close the individual Q&A then, and perhaps jump into a broader one. So I invite the other panelists to switch their cameras on, if possible, please. And I think I'll start with a question that's been flagged as not being addressed just yet, and it's for you, Colin. Do you think the change of working practices in home office can be linked with low/zero carbon retrofit? I think we did discuss a little bit about the role of COVID, but I just wonder if you could expand specifically on this point.
It's an interesting point. Anecdotal evidence suggests that people are investing a lot more into their homes at the moment. There's a lack of building supplies everywhere in the country, for example. But what we are seeing at the same time is lots of people building huge garden sheds as kind of workout and home working spaces. So the question is whether all this investment is poured into that, into additional floor area rather than into investing into the building fabric of existing buildings. So I think this is something that will need to be closely monitored, because I think there's a tendency towards the former rather than the latter.
Yeah, I mean, I'm grateful that I haven't had to build a shed, but I certainly know of a few people who have, and you see sometimes, don't you, on calls that you have these quite wonderful backdrops. Okay, I think I haven't had any other questions come in, so I'd just like to or perhaps actually what I'll do is I wonder if any panelists have any questions for others. Perhaps now is an opportunity I can throw it to you, because I'm conscious I've hogged a lot of the questions myself. Yeah, Tim.
I mean, just to pick up on, I think Jake Barnes asked the question about the sort of policy implications of our work, and he sort of had a follow up in the chat, and you know, one of the issues where we think the pathways and branching points approach can be useful is in terms of this sort of keeping options open. You know, that's sort of one of the things in this policy space. There's a lot of uncertainty, so certainly at the early stages, there's certainly value in keeping options open and exploring different pathways and you know, sort of seeing what works and what doesn't. But of course, that doesn't mean governments can sort of put off decision making forever. So there's still you know, needs to be strategic decisions made, but we think this sort of pathways and branching points is sort of more conducive to that sort of learning approach and learning about what works and what doesn't.
Thank you, Tim. Catherine, was there anything you wanted to add on that, or are you content for the time being?
No, that was a nice answer from Tim. I do have a question for Claire, if you don't have any others.
Yeah, that would be great. Go ahead.
I just wondered about the knowledge exchange example from CREDS, whether there are any particular things that you need to think about in knowledge exchange in this kind of decarbonisation, sustainability space that's potentially different from other types of knowledge exchange, for example, in technology.
My overall answer is probably no, is what I would say, in the sense that the different, well, particularly from the papers is what I would say. So from my own experience, I would say no, because I've come from lots of different environmental areas, and to be honest, it's about the people, it's not about the technologies. So it's about getting to know people and, you know, and then influencing the way they think. So it's about changing perspectives and things like that. And you definitely go on a journey together over time. In terms of CREDS, I mean, the whole point of CREDS is that it looks at the technologies and the social. So we look at very much kind of how people use the technology. And that then obviously lends itself very much to this kind of way of working in terms of a knowledge exchange, because you have to be in touch with the people anyway. So we've already potentially done surveys of or questionnaires or whatever with the individuals, like Colin did with his work kind of thing. You know, you've already done a questionnaire, and therefore then follow up in terms of knowledge exchange and altering people's views is the next kind of obvious step, because you've already made a link with them through a different way of working. So it's kind of picking up on those processes and moving forward. So if you've already got an existing relationship, obviously build on that. If you haven't, then, you know, find a way of, you know, working with them. So there's lots of different ways that you can actually pick up and build personal relationships, even if you don't already have them.
And I think that broadly touches on a question that we've had come in from Tina Fawcett on does knowledge exchange need to be professionalised? And in CREDS, lucky to have dedicated staff for this, but that's not always the case. It's something a humble researcher can do.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I came from a humble researcher. I'm still a humble researcher, is what I would say. So I don't think you can ever change that. But I mean, you know, I recognise that, you know, some people are very focused on their, you know, very focused on their individual areas, but that doesn't mean that they can't do knowledge exchange. I mean, knowledge exchange is just about talking to people, which is what we're doing here. So I mean, you know, we're already all doing it to an extent. But what I would say is that within CREDS, we've tried to do it more and better. And that's the whole reason for doing this you know, this study of 80 papers, was to work out, well, we already have a team of 8 people who are doing this stuff, and we come from all sorts of professional backgrounds, and we've been doing it for many years, most of us. But we also recognize that we don't know it all. And so we went away to the papers to see how other people are doing it, whether there's anything we can learn from it. So, and then, you know, the whole point is that we've tried to then distill all that learning into kind of these 11 points, which obviously from 80 papers was, you know, we've missed out a lot, is what I would say. But I think it gives a flavor of the kinds of things that you can do. And I would say that those 11 factors are applicable pretty much to anything, pretty much to any technical field, any types of projects. Whether you're a researcher, whether you're a policymaker, no matter who you are, you could still use some of those techniques. And it's not to say you should use all of them all of the time, because that is a huge amount of effort and work. But I think if you just improved a little bit, you know, and did a little bit here and a little bit there, you know, overall, over time, you'd find there would be an improvement. And what I would say in general is pick up the phone and talk to people. That's, you know, that in terms of knowledge exchange, that's the best way to do it. And, you know, even with COVID, we can still pick up the phone. So, you know, that's, to me, in its simplest, you know, process, that is the thing to do, is to pick up the phone and make a personal relationship.
Thank you, Claire. And I should probably add that humble researcher are not my own words. As a non-researcher, I wasn't trying to be derogatory or anything like that. I thought I'd close with a question for all of you. I've tried to find a common thread, and I think the aim of today's panel was to look at how future policy could be guided in a better way, I suppose. So whether that's considering the just transition a little bit more, whether that's making better use of knowledge exchange, or indeed having a greater understanding of the branching points and different futures for heat decarbonisation. And I'm sure a lot of you would have spoken to policymakers about this, and I'd be interested to hear, have you had feedback on, or how has this been perceived when it's been presented to others outside of the, I suppose, more of a research community? And would you, I suppose you've touched on it a little bit just then, Claire, but what advice would you give to either policymakers as a first step looking to take on some of your recommendations further, or even as fellow researchers or practitioners that want to embed some of the principles that we've discussed today into their work a little bit more? So can I'll start with you, Colin, if that's okay, and then make my way around.
Sure, thank you. I mean, it's a great question. I think part of the problem with energy policy making is that it tends to be very siloed, and policymakers often don't have the luxury to take a step back, really, to take in the bigger picture. At the same time, we also have to understand that policymaking organisations such as, like in the UK, for example, you have the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. They harbour a huge range of views and talents. And there are people that are very well aware of how things can be changed. And there might be people that have the right kind of idea. They're just waiting for the right kind of window of opportunity to arrive at a political level to put forward their particular ideas, so that these branching points, if you like, they might just arise kind of quite randomly out of opportunity from a policy-making perspective. And it is about making these opportunities occur. And I think in academia, we play an important role in shifting, if you like, the Overton window of what is possible and can be discussed in that direction to enable these discussions to happen, and then for this opportunity for potential pathway for branching of pathways to happen.
Brilliant, thank you, Colin. Can I turn to Tim and Catherine, please?
Thanks, James. And I would certainly agree with the way Colin characterised the policy space there. And I think one of the things that we are hoping to do with this work is to allow policy actors looking at it to have some confidence in a way that they can make some of these changes, so that they need to be ready to step in rather than waiting for solutions or particular ways forward to emerge. I think that's one of the things that we're sort of finding in talking to them, that there's often a lot of understanding and a wanting to make things better, but not always a feeling of entitlement, if you like, to use their position to make that shift.
Yeah, I mean, just building on that. I mean, I think what we've found is that you know, policymakers are in general sort of, you know, very well aware of the complexity of many of these issues, but don't necessarily feel they have all the tools to sort of map that complexity. And I think that's sort of what we were trying to do, was to take some of the learning and insights from the academic literature and think about how that could be translated into something which was hopefully more useful for policymakers. But I mean, it's as Claire said, I mean, it is a two-way process. So it's also, you know, we need to learn from policymakers as to what would be useful for that. So.
I think that almost perfectly tees up Claire to come in then on the finally on the knowledge exchange side of things.
Yeah, so I mean, I kind of agree with both, well, you know, the other speakers in the sense that, I mean, you know, Colin's point about taking the opportunity. I mean, it is very much about taking the opportunity, is what I would say, you know. So when there are particular windows within policy development, so, you know, they're doing a consultation or something, you know, if the consultation's out, then, you know, academics should take the opportunity to comment on that consultation, is what I would say, and then their information can be cited. And that's one of the examples we use in our paper, is the fact that actually over time, over the last 3 years, we've done a lot of consultation responses, and they're all on our website as well. So I mean, we've linked with policymakers in that way, because that's when they want to see the change, the new information, if you like. But then there's also an opportunity to get in much earlier than that and actually influence the consultancy documents as well. What's actually consulted on, is what I would say. And if you're there regularly talking to them anyway about all sorts of other stuff, you know, they might turn to you and say, well, actually, you know, if you're talking to me about this, do you know anything about this? Is there anybody within your group that could talk to me about this? And then, you know, and that's one of the things I would say about CREDS, is the fact that we cover such a vast range of, you know, different topic areas, that actually if we're talking to one, you know, we're talking to the heat team or whatever, then they can say to us, well, actually, you know, have you got anybody in CREDS that talks, you know, that can talk to us about this? And then we have done a lot of linkages to put them in touch with somebody else. And we've actually, interestingly, got a meeting next week with a different team within BEIS that we haven't spoken to before. And that's because within BEIS itself, we've been talking to, I don't know, 2 different departments, 2 different groups. And then they've said, CREDS has been useful, you know, and they've passed us on to somebody else. And now they've made an appointment for us for 3 of the researchers, for us to go and talk to them. So there is this kind of networking process. So I like your connections. So going to Kat's talk, you know, the connections and the branching very much does work in terms of knowledge exchange as well, and actually getting policymakers, you know. But then the other thing about CREDS is the fact that we're a 5-year project, and we're at the end of 3 years, and often research projects are only 3 years. So it is interesting that actually that timing issue, in the sense that obviously we've got a lot to say now because we've got a lot of stuff out there, if you like. But if we'd have only been 3 years long, we wouldn't have had the next 2 years to do this building. So this networking and branching process doesn't necessarily happen within research projects because they're quite short. So I would say that there are a lot of challenges.
Brilliant, thank you, Claire. And I think the synergies between these presentations today is not something I particularly anticipated, but it's been great to see how there is so much overlap. Yeah, and thank you again to all the speakers. So there's just a few things I want to mention before we wrap up. We very much used the time, which I didn't really expect we would, which may indeed be my fault. So just a couple of housekeeping things. We've got 2 sessions at 4:15 today, both in meeting mode, which means you can switch your cameras on and have discussions with other delegates. And one is is an exploration of how sound and visualization can lead to a renewed connection to the energy system. And the other looks at urban net zero and renewable energy commitments during COVID-19, certainly relevant to a couple of things we've discussed today. And then at 6 p.m, the exciting, fun summer study party is going to be happening. So check the agenda in Hoover for details on how to join. And then the very final thing I wanted to say is thank you to not just the speakers today, but all the speakers for panel 2, and also to Heike as well, the co-leader for this panel. It's been a fantastic experience, and I hope you've all enjoyed it as well. So thank you very much and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks a lot.